Hello everyone, today we conclude our series for the 700th anniversary of Dante's death, and we have covered an important amount of information. I would say I'm satisfied by this, small series. After all, incidentally, we ended up talking about Dante also in other contexts, given that we have talked consistently, especially in the last month, about 13th and 14th century European history. So we have covered much of the international background, fundamentally, naturally connecting it to his work, to his life, and the reasons why such an extraordinary figure came out of this that I have defined from years to this point, and I hope you have gotten this, as one of the cornerstone, let's say, of our medieval history interpretation as the acme of medieval civilization, right? This idea of tumultuous growth from the 11th to 12th, even before, right? That's but chiefly during the 12th and 13th century. In the early 14th century, but the crisis was a bit already there before the mid of the century when it broke out, definitely, and therefore we're looking at the pinnacle, and so that also the title of this series as Dante, the Voice of Medieval Civilization. It's properly identifying that medieval Italian poet, and as we've seen, not just a poet for that matter, but also a politician, a knight, at least a moneylender, an ambassador, a magistrate, right, a treatiser, and much more than that even. A mysterious figure, right, as mysterious in a sense as the work, like his work for a modern audience, right? That is a bit the condition that we find ourselves when looking at Dante and considering his work and what it meant in the history of the world, Western civilization, and properly in the Middle Ages, right? And today I want to talk about essentially the reception of Dante's work from his times to our own, and expressing some general, even personal consideration as for somebody who maybe has never approached Dante's work. I've had some the fortune of doing it at different levels, and it's not an easy journey. I can tell you that. And it's not meant to be. And this is, in a sense, the meaning of Dante's work, right? And we will see how his figure was essentially, interpreted. How and why was it interpreted in our times? I mean, you see, 700 years is not even that much, right? Especially when so many other things historically happened, how so many different worldviews and other authors and works and discoveries have come about, and therefore we tend to say, but why should we go back to the Middle Ages and picking this, in fact, as we were saying, mysterious, kind of obscure figure in a way, and that it was as we've seen so much, but it was fundamentally just a Tuscan citizen that yes, he had an important political role. He knew his business. He knew the world of his times. He knew certain central key figures from Henry VII, Can Grande della Scala, Boniface VIII, right? All these names that really made a difference in those times and places, at a level that, in fact, in a sense, I presume many kids, at least today, have probably the difficulties of contextualizing. That's why we make so many manualistic history videos at some point, because I can't go in depth in detail with many things, but sometimes I realize that it's important to insist on the essentials, on the fundamentals, to get them right, because they're the starting point, right? And a great part of our civilizational problem is that we have avoided that. We just skipped to the narrower specialistic thing without actually even stopping to reflect on the comprehensive, on the synthesis, on the whole, right? And that's why Dante is so important, because medieval civilization embodied by his thought and work and character in so many ways, was able to express this enormous synthesis, right? The pinnacle of universalism, in a way. Dante, as we've seen, was already anachronistic by his own times, because the would have been maybe the generation of his father that would have fit properly. Maybe not even completely, right? Maybe the one between his grandfather and father, in the full universalism, right? And that's also a myth in a way, but not quite when you consider what people lived by at the time, what these learned individuals that, especially like Dante, created a culture. You can argue even out of scratch, in a way, right? It's not just that Dante invented properly the Italian language as a literary one, or he, was able to describe essentially the entire universe, the entire scientific, theological, in fact, literary, and even lower aspect of the work, right? In all, as a comprehensive thing, but properly having a synthesis capacity to make sense of it, and to therefore provide with some universal values that still have a meaning, because universal values are meant to be that, right? We don't search universal values because they are, relative to our times and places. We search for universal values exactly because those values are not relative, and they fit a broader existential condition. And studying history is, in a sense, the more you accumulate in this regard, is what you're unavoidably led to do, right? This is something I discovered over the years, even talking with colleagues, with other people, that, of course, the more you study history and the more you realize the necessity of an authority, of a hierarchy, of an order, of a discipline, of a system that makes sense, because you are meant to make sense of it properly, comprehensive, because you have an individual responsibility for that fits in a broader civilizational role, right? And this is something, again, that we are lacking today, and we are ever hungrier. That, at least, I think pop culture, especially in conservatism, has realized that it's not just about tradition strictly meant, which of course is important, because much of that knowledge and wisdom is passed on to us also in that way, and that history indeed shows you how fundamentally something that we see today as intellectual achievement, of a conquest of of modernity and progress, actually was, it's something that people knew already by default thousands of years ago, like a common knowledge, like even when not rationalized, but they were simply living by it, right? So looking at what happened in between, right, and the Middle Ages, even though polemically are exactly this, right, the age in between, right, the Middle Age, is crucial in a sense to draw those connections, right, even from the previous times. I mean, think about the role of Virgil in the comedy, and in the modernity, of course, of Dante, even as a visionary, what would have occurred in the future, even a kind of a truly, civically meant democratic, which doesn't mean kind of it actually in a very exclusivistic way, but because it was loaded in meaning and responsibility, that so everybody, as Christians, endowed, of course, of the possibility and the duty of knowledge, men and women alike, right? For a time in history where, as you know, the general understanding was, opinion was quite different overall, and maybe just apparently, but still quite bold, considering what the properly the society was structured like, and what Dante, that after all was elite, right, himself. He was a nobleman, right, in the communal sense, but still, right, these were, again, knights. They were trained for war, they were rich, they had lands, they had serfs, they had all these things. So that's yet another aspect that we forget about Dante, and the point of today's video is in fact to realize this, that Dante has been interpreted by different points of view throughout the centuries that, of course, had a partial vision, right, and that didn't properly care at some point or manage to picture in the deeper meaning that Dante's work itself was present. So we could simply start from the history of it, because there are, and I'm somewhat embarrassed to start these topics considering that this is just a meager YouTube video, because there are, again, oceans of inks spilled on to write on these topics, literally, philologically, historiography. I mean, it's big, right? It's really big, even theologically, anthropologically, scientifically, even. Because again, Dante covered all of this, right? So we understand that the commedia actually, was essentially began to circulate while Dante was still alive, famously enough. We understand that the Inferno and the Purgatory already between 1313 and 1316, while the Paradise actually after Dante's death. And here it was all an issue of, in fact, his we don't know exactly what were the early texts and how they were spread and so on. We just know more or less how it happened. And it happened in different ways. You know, the first place that received Dante's work was Florence, that had an early recognition of Dante's work, not just because he was Florentine himself, of course, but because, you know, for the same reason why Dante had existed in the first place. That is to say, Florence was a quite culturally advanced center that would appreciate this kind of thing. We know that even in Dante's time, like, even though he, as you know, he lived in northern Italy, he eventually died there as an exile, people didn't quite read him very much. Yet, at least, it was not known, because the literary landscape was quite varied, was quite florid, let's say, and there were different genres, and Dante wasn't fitting that pretty much, right? And in many ways, he wasn't fitting much because he was innovative, even in his genius, but also, and maybe especially, because he was still kind of archaic, right, or conservative or traditional. It's difficult to label him in this sense, but let's say he had visions even about even linguistics and other things that were being pioneered at that point, quite an advanced way in Italy. That was also quite, it was multilingual in a way. For example, French literature and the chivalry, they were all over the courts that Dante frequented, for example, and so on. But I don't know, some Italian scholars at the time had, for example, a much better understanding of the linguistical division of the various regional dialects than Dante had, right? But still, Dante created modern Italian in that literary sense. So, it's a paradox. I mean, this happens historically, that even the genius is unregulated in a way, or is regulated in a way that can be quite odd, but still containing a quality that surpasses everything else. But let's say in general, Dante eventually was appreciated mostly from the mid 14th century, when Boccaccio, that was a great admirer of his, and together with Petrarch, they were essentially both Florentines. Okay, Petrarch wasn't born there, but his father was one of the exiles that, as Dante had fled Florence exactly in those years because of the Black Welf's regime and so on. And they all had somewhat, in fact, as they were somewhat all white Guelphs in nature, so they all had kind of some Ghibelline pro-imperial sympathy, as you know. And as we have seen in the previous videos, that is what Dante fundamentally is politically mostly famous for, and the role of the empire and the equilibrium between the two powers. It was very universal in nature, whereas, as we've seen just a decade after his death, there were some radical ideas that would basically take out even the papacy completely in its secular power, that were, again, they seem like 1 century after Dante, instead not, right? Because they were quite precocious in their own field, and Dante was quite, as we've seen, anachronistic already by his time. But also this stresses the polarity, the vivacity of the debate, right, and how central this was, and also how brutally the world changed in those very years. In any case, at that point, central and northern Italy began to read Dante, and we were talking about the people in general, right? Italy was quite literate, so commoners read Dante, or at least they had it told. They had it by, in fact, this kind of public readings and things like that. People copied his work. They learned by heart some lines, famously enough, and the intellectuals mostly appreciated the vastity of the doctrine that Dante displayed. This encyclopedical knowledge that you have to understand how much medieval people knew, right? And with the means of the time, right? So these are all pre-Linnean times. There is no understanding of modern physics. Manuscripts were extremely costly. These people lived, as Dante's life beautifully exemplifies, between political strifes, wars, battles, raids, exiles, risk in being killed from a moment to another, and yet they found spontaneously, because Dante was not just like other of his just like Cavalcanti or other of his friends, but they were free, as we've seen. They were noblemen. They did whatever they wanted. They chose, together with their normal training, to educate themselves, and to educate themselves in a radical way, learning an astonishing amount of stuff, and with neurocognitive capacities that we have completely abandoned in the way our educational systems work. Right? At this point, you could find somebody that knew the Bible by heart. There were these people, right? Hardware costed, so people invested in memory, right? They knew, they were capable of that dramatic synthesis that today we're not capable of anymore, because we don't have a memory anymore. We can access knowledge easily, but we don't care to store it in our brains, because it's just a click away. Why should I make that fatigue? At that point, it was literally an economical investment. It meant becoming, like in the case of Dante, an exception, of course, but literally the greatest author in the history of medieval history. You can argue without any doubt. And doing what? Because we don't even know, as we've seen, even the details about his life is somewhat obscure, right? And this, as we've seen in his work, was directed still at being understood by everybody, right? His choice of vernacular over Latin for the same comedy could have been written either in Latin or in French, as it would have been kind of, Dante would have done. He chose vernacular on purpose, so that even artisans, shopkeepers, the people, common people, right, were struck by the narrative force with which the ultra terrestrial world was represented, right? Because this condensed essentially their hopes, their terrors, and they recognize within it, and willingly, characters that were impressed in the collective fantasy or memory. This relevance in the lived world, not in an abstraction, but in the actual reality. It's as if today, somebody wrote, who could write something like the comedy today, and fitting all the various, world leaders or politicians or people even they would know locally, but still fitting them into a universal system of of penalties and rewards that is based on a standard universal value. And giving so much more than that, right? It's not gossip. This is properly showing what the world should be like, hierarchically and rationally and orderly, and in terms of faith at the same time. So after Dante's death, the comedy was read in church, in the universities, right? The learned man commented abundantly with great works on his work, on Dante's comedy, and the same figure of Dante as a disdainful and solitary wise man became almost proverbial, so much that some believed that he actually had been in the afterlife to have been able to write such things. And by the 14th century, and especially the new atmosphere of of introversion, I would say, of a reclusion in oneself in front of the horrors of the world, of the plague, of the misery, of the wars, etc. What was surely facilitating in a way the introspective nature of Dante's work, right? Dante, let's say, there may be, I know it's a bit forced, but in a way it's like reading some of the greatest minds in times of, think about the St. von Clausewitz, right? Even at that point, it was an age of enlightenment, fundamentally, as the 18th century could be in a rationalistic sense, right? As scholastics had been in the 13th, right? And then, or even the arts like Mozart at the same time, right? The champion of classicism. But still, in these authors, you still find the romanticism of the 19th century kicking in some, and so it's almost a synthesis, an hybrid, right? In different ways, because Dante, just like Mozart, you can argue that you find this kind of sentimental element within it that is what their whole work is loaded with, but still they're both capable of expressing this as a classical form. That is to say, it's not just a sentimentalistic abandonment, it's properly being able to cover the whole spectrum of human emotions in their art, in their work. Right? This is extremely important, because the first thing is to make sense of the world, not just following feelings, right? Reason is at the center of everything. It's a reason that can be even transcendent, of course, and be substantiated in faith, but is always accompanied by probably a rational process at the same time, because the two things cannot exist without the other, right? It's just a comprehensive worldview, and it's not a surprise, right, that these conceptions have always been expressed by the greatest thinkers in the history of mankind, and the necessity of this order, and of a God, by the way, because for what God means really in a deeply and purely and absolutely scientific point of view, fashion. So this is important when you read Dante as well, because Dante really speaks to you, right? I don't know if you ever read him, and I will try to tell you something about that, but the must should be for any person who believes in universal values and at least wants to claim himself to be a Westerner, that if you don't read Dante, there is really no way one could make any claim of such sort. So starting from the second half of the 14th century, however, times were changing, right? Because of the affirmation of humanism. And it's relevant, as we were saying before, that humanism was invented by, a guy that was fundamentally Dante's lover, admirer, successor in a sense, Petrarch himself, right? So as we've seen, a fellow of Tuscan, if not properly Florentines, still Petrarch, a huge admirer, just as Boccaccio, so they were friends because of that reason, and so Dante opened literally a literary branch in Europe that was never closed. It just flourished in basically in every single corner of the continent, and these were the first say, brains that really, dominated the thing, and yet there was the seed of something else that was reflecting the change of time. It's something that we're observing also today in this form of retreat, right? Dante is relevant for our times also because of this, the idea of a great phase of expansion, of positive attitude, of progress, of improvement, of reason, faith in science, even properly in a material way, like the 20th century, and then now sort of crisis that strikes morally but also economically, and we having even had the plague now, even in a much less dramatic way that they had back then, but still, morally speaking, we're living in that situation of retreat in a way. And humanism was this. Petrarch embodied this probably better than anybody else. And with humanism was a lot of classicism kicking back, that came back essentially from the re-feudalization of Europe, essentially from the re-elitization of Europe, right? Dante had been the expression of that citizenry, almost soldiery, even, also his participation in Florentine army and battles and so on, that was so radically passionate and, immersed in the world where they participated, as we've seen, as knights, magistrates. Like, they covered the whole spectrum of politics, society, and even of war, right? In Petrarch's time, with humanism, it's the elite taking over once again. It's the courts, is the same authors, right, as the Dante could have been, and Dante partially also experimented in his own life after the exile, were now, in fact, courtiers. They were paid, maintained by lords that naturally wanted these scholars to, to more or less, incense them, and provide with a worldview that had to not to be just a purely, purely free in political stuff, but that they would have to reflect also their grandeur and so on. So they were not magistrates, politicians, soldiers, and these people were just, in fact, humanists, were just literates, right? And never commit the mistake in thinking that Dante had been that, right? Dante has to survive in exile, roaming these courts of northern Italy that were much more, privatistic, militaristic in nature than, Florence, the champion of republicanism and kind of, popular, if not democratic, in big word and anachronistically meant, but still model, right? So in Dante's life there is this as well, but with Petrarch we have it definitely and completely, right? And so the Ancien regime has affirmed itself. It will remain up to the 18th century. So Europe, actually during the Renaissance, during modern times, doesn't actually go towards the, doesn't actually substantiate itself in the freedom of the communes, in this idea of exasperated, liberty and, fight against authority. There are not the forces anymore, right? It's the triumph of the monarchies, of the principalities, of absolutism. It was never quite absolute, but still, right? So that's the lower classes, the middle classes, thinned down towards the end of the Middle Ages. They're maybe in absolute terms there is an improvement, but in relative terms the elites are becoming overwhelmingly more powerful, and they keep everybody under. So humanists are the intellectual expression of this order, right? So aesthetically speaking, Dante's style doesn't fit the orientation of the new atmosphere, because differently from Petrarch, he was not inspired by a aesthetical, let's say, ideal of noble balance and harmony, right? That had to reflect ancient, classical works and so on, right? Because Petrarch is not a citizen that fights anymore. He doesn't need to be that. His task is mostly philological, right? He has to replicate perfectly the classical Latin, Cicero's Latin. That's the obsession of the humanists and of the Renaissance, is copying the Greeks and the Romans. And we have, as moderns, acquired the idea that somewhat was an improvement that derived from that, which is just a progressistic, modernistic, and technologistic bias, while what we see in the Renaissance is mostly essentially a product of medieval civilization that by that time was already more advanced than what the classical world had been. But still, we have both narrative and, for reasons that now we can't digress on, but that you understand somewhat. And Dante was, in a sense, not forgotten, because everybody kind of read him, and every author in Europe at that point drew from that, because you couldn't understand, in fact, nor Petrarch, nor Boccaccio, but not even Shakespeare or Cervantes or Ariosto without Dante. It wouldn't make any sense, right? And nor any other thing that has ever been written ever since in Western civilization. But that's where, and that perhaps was the most damaging moment, because paradoxically Dante was transformed in a myth, right? Was transformed into a holy figure, right? The poet par excellence, at least after the classical authors together with him. And there is no doubt that also in the Renaissance, in modern Europe, Italian was the third classical language, the language of basically every field of human application, and that Dante had been the creator of that, literally speaking. But in this idealization, and sacralization, the meaning of Dante's work and life, so the cultural background, the context, was lost. I mean, just think about what the humanists and the Renaissance thought about the Middle Ages. I mean, they are the ones who invented the term in a derogatory way. So could they like Dante, aside from, those aspects that were seemingly more projected towards modernity, in a way, towards a more humanistic direction, which was surely present in Dante. Dante was a great, connoisseur of Latin, of many other languages. So he had all a philological, stylistical, temper that of course was in consonance with much of what eventually humanism would have developed like, right? And so Petrarch wasn't inventing that. In a sense, it had always happened, right? The West had always looked at the classical past, but was doing it still in Dante's time with a very pragmatic intent, not for the sake of itself, not for transforming it into an ism, but for trying to find that kind of universal that could fit the knowledge that in the meanwhile also the medieval world had gathered and began to organize in a very original way. Not just the idea of the copy of classicism, which is still what most Westerners actually still believe in deliriously enough. So there is a big leap forward chronologically before Dante came at the center of the interests of the readers and of the scholars. The 19th century, Romanticism, right? Yes, there had been something like, even, I don't know, during the Reformation, some authors had appreciated Dante's complaints against the corruption of the Roman Church and all these things, but Dante was not really would have not really been a fan of the Reformation, of the schism and so on. It was a completely different background. So let's say that also many other things we were saying were going on at that point, literally speaking, and the world was changing, and so Europeans were to make sense of many other things that dramatically enough were making them lose their points of reference, in which apparently, at least, as up to that point, that they had really remained in a mindset that could be, after all, aside from the elite humanists, kind of the same one Dante was expressing, right? Many people think, the discovery of the Americas is the problem of the other peoples in the world. Not much. It's really the Reformation, the biggest tragedy of all, right? By always remember, we see the 16th century as the moment, in fact, of progress, of modernity. It was hardly so. The 16th century was one of the darkest periods, as it was lived by the people who lived in it, right? Eventually, the modernistic myth was also grafted on the Reformation, of course, the idea that especially the northern countries, the ones that had embraced the reform and had autonomized from the Pope, had acquired kind of an autonomy that they invested in other directions, in colonialism, etc. Of course, has brought to unavoidably to think that the 16th century was a positive moment, right? But say history tells us another story. So much else was happening. Even the Turkish wars had an impact in this sense. So it's not before the West came back to be confident of himself, in a sense, albeit devoid of strictly universalistic models, such as the idea of papacy and empire, right? But in the 19th century, the Westerners dominated the world, right? And so, in this new absolute, in this new sense of confidence, of affirmation, etc., and at the same time of a reevaluation of what could be, in fact, the roots of the various national and probably not even beyond that, but probably what could be at the root of Europe, of the West, of its moral dimension, of the feelings, etc. Dante was recovered, was reappreciated. And this is quite interesting. As you know, especially in Britain, there was all kind of a new, Gothicism or medievalism came back prepotently, and also with a certain vision of history of the various countries, etc., that probably left some of the greatest damage, let's say, in the perception, let's call it in this way, of probably what the Middle Ages were, and of Dante himself, in a way. Most of what people know today about the Middle Ages has nothing to do with the Middle Ages, has to do with medievalism, invented in the 19th century, in very narrow, in terms of time and space, meant contexts. And even in here we could digress enormously on how much we have, in fact, equivocated, even in there, Dante's figure. But at the same time, the 19th century is the moment of great, advancement in all fields of application. So, and also in historiography, like, yes, during the 17th, the 18th century, already, big steps in philologically speaking have been done. But it's the 19th century that mostly sets the standards. There's still, when you write a historical work, you say, when did this the interest toward this topic began? It's good to start with the idea that, in the 19th century, certain authors began to say this and that, because there are certain standards were considered as scientifically, finally, acceptable in synchrony with today's standards still. And the Romantic 19th century appreciated mostly Dante's visionary force, the vigor of the moral and civil message, which indeed are correct points, right? The idea, as we've seen, that Dante was really considering himself like a prophet. Dante was made at this point, the main misinterpretation is just considering Dante as the poet, right, or the man of letters of the, or even the dramatic. This sense of decadentism and and darkness and conspiratorial character of the Italian city-states, and then or at the time from a Protestant perspective, the morally putter-sent South, in a sense that was so tormented and dysfunctional and so on, but that after all, created this genius, this mind that nobody could deny in a Renaissance perspective in that way. Dante, as we've seen, was dramatically and inexhaustibly more than that, meaning that still today, if you look at the historiography that comes out about Dante, first of all, we're stressing that we don't like properly. There is not a way, let's say, a frame you can build around Dante himself, because his work is so polyedric, polymatic, let's say, properly in his knowledge, and his figure is so mysterious still that it becomes very risky to even sew a specific cloth over the character. And secondly, that there is still an awful lot to dig in the archives about the whole literary historical tradition of the author, if not Dante's autograph itself, which is like a bit the grail of for all paleographers and philologists at some point, because much of the 14th century is still to be studied. I can tell you because I ended up specializing in that, and we think as Westerners that we know the Middle Ages well, that more or less we have an idea of what happened in the 14th century. Well, yes, if you pick the bigger, the main highlights, yes, but in terms of the if you just descend a little bit beyond the surface, you realize that so many historical interpretation, I mostly studied them from a military point of view, so I can tell you that it's real, right? After years spent to write my doctoral thesis, that we have gotten a lot of things wrong, right? Not just incorrectly, but properly wrong. And most of the problem is the preconceptions that we have used in absence of an actual understanding. So it's not much that we don't know, but that we fabricate, as always, some narratives that do not stand on their feet. So it's really limiting to consider the Dante's work for itself and not having, for example, an adequate historical background. This is a great risk that the same history of literature has per se, right? Many people do not. Of course, I mean, the experts make a good job, and there is no doubt about this, but let's say there's not just literature as such, right? There is also anthropology, there is a history of religion, there is military history, there are many, also history of psychology, with all the quotients, of course, that now everybody wants to explain the things psychologically, but it's really very, very, very complicated. In any case, Dante's figure is still all to be understood, in a way. And this leaving aside for the end of the video what properly popular culture knows or better doesn't know by any stretch of the imagination about nor the guy nor the context at that point. The moral and civil message is indeed the most important part perhaps to start from, meaning that even the visionary element is naturally all religious, but political and military at the same time, right? What fascinates, and so there's Dante citizen, Dante knight, Dante ambassador, Dante exile, Dante imperial, supporter in a sense, and diplomat, and lots of things in this regard that you would expect would have been put always at the center of what we think of the guy. Instead, I presume most people do not really consider Dante beyond his literary dimension, or at least do not connect the same to the actual context without which basically all of that has no meaning. And also the idea of empire, right? There is an element in Dante's work that I've always been curious of, and I would like to write to some experts and to ask for some information, relatively to the understanding that Dante could have about the connection that is evident, right, in all his work between the ancient world and his own times, and most of the universal perspective that could even, of course, transcend them and make him so, in fact, modern and insightful in many ways. Because much of the creatures of the myth, the myths, the figures, that he uses, especially, I mean, think about the Inferno mostly, right? All the monsters and the demons and etc. Well, many of them are actually inspired to the classical world that was hyper-loaded, as we have seen in the videos we make about Indo-European, Indo-Europeistics mostly, with meanings that are in fact universal, and that the Middle Ages had kind of chewed and in its own way, not understanding them fully, in a strictly religious sense. Also because most of the people who wrote at the time were clergy, so they couldn't start making treatises on pagan mythology just per se, right? So but these laymen, just like Dante, that in the Italian communal civilization surely were the embodiment of culture and the peak actually of the same in Europe at the time. And so very, very different from even here what you expect, the average medieval intellectual, like essentially a clergyman living in a court, right? And here you have a citizen studying, as a secular individual in everything, and getting an encyclopedical knowledge, even of theology, of literally everything that explains you how the world is made, how physics works, right? And so I'm radically fascinated by the idea that Dante may have actually understood much more deeply than we think, the greater meanings that stood behind tradition. Because most of what we see from mythology and paganism and so on, it is of course what has arrived to us in, either was written by the Christian authors, and so we got in an historiographical tradition that, as we've seen, wasn't much interested in the pagan elements, but still handed it down to us and read it and knew about that. And let's say a folkloristic background that was surely alive, and we can think 700 years ago, right? If you think of some stories of your grandparents or great grandparents, right? They still lived here in Europe in a sort of not completely secularized dimension. They believed still in things like, I don't know, the werewolves, or in the cycles of nature with a meaning and in a passion and a feeling that we have lost now, right? In our concrete cubes and cities where we don't even see the stars anymore, and so you can imagine by the 14th century that even that average shopkeeper, or even a peasant, if you ever heard of Dante, which was not a rare thing, especially in a place like Italy, where the city was always connected to the countryside, right? There was no place out there that lived detached from these centers of culture, differently from other areas in Europe where you still have really hundreds of kilometers of forest with people living there, really not knowing anything. I'd say would recognize in some monsters, in some names, in some atmospheres, those pagan beliefs that now were living and coexisting absolutely with the Christian ones, as long as they didn't challenge them from theologically speaking. And of course, paganism never could achieve that. But in terms of properly of passions, of symbols, of emotions, those things were still pretty damn alive, right? And I wonder whether Dante that still wrote in a kind of elevated sense and even when he descended into, the bad language of hell, for describing the most vicious things, was not really, in fact, writing a pagan mythological treatise, would actually understand in fact, the same feelings that such symbols would evoke in people. And the same goes actually for the most elevated matter of heaven, and how much heaven was explained in the Latin Germanic world through some symbols that were pretty universal and also pre-Christian, and shared with Christianity, that after all had emerged from the Old Testament, is still fundamentally still polytheistic in some nature. There are sacrifices to various gods, and it's literally it's widely known, right? For those people who said, Christianity copied from paganism. No, it kind of emerged from what we call paganism, but which was the only thing that existed. So it's not a copyright issue, cultural appropriation. It's just a form of paganism that evolved into something more, in fact, something monotheistic, and that brought that to the extreme. But it couldn't be detached by any stretch of the imagination by all the symbology, and the Christianity is enriched and elevated by the enormous semantic, symbological, all the set of meanings that, of course, exist in the world now. And they were pagan in that sense. And what would you expect for something born, in fact, at the time of Christ? It's not a negative thing that depreciates Christianity and elevates paganism. It's something extremely different, and Dante's work is also properly, by showing this pagan dimension, of course, explaining you what every person with a minimal historical education, not even in history or religions, knows about what it means, for us to have gone through, for passing from polytheism to monotheism, and why that happened, and why it was a civilizationally positive path, right, and morally and scientifically so, which the Middle Ages embodied so clamorously and gloriously, in terms of properly of the dignity of human civilization, and Dante pinnacling that. So, from the 19th century, so Dante became popular, right? Also, mass society at that point, whatever was, recovered in it, even in the elite, was spread in among the masses, right? Even, I don't know, think about for a country like Italy that had acquired, the political unity just at that point, and all the, nationalistic mythology, right? Dante was rightfully among in this sense, rightfully so, because other figures wouldn't be so evidently, from a historical point of view, are a bit fit in like that, but an enormous model that all the kids would have to learn, and still today, fundamentally, Dante's mandatory such things. And so, from a certain time onwards, this is not anecdotal, tens of millions of people schooled with at least the essentials, and even some properly knowledge and study in a uniform, systematized way, at least of Dante's comedy and knowing the figure, and this thing going more popular, and still, of course, remaining at the center of academic debate worldwide, and so also the instrumentalization of Dante, right? That became symbol of everything at that point, or one thing or the other, right, left or right, lots of different perspectives that were really, as being cannibalized in a way, like just mass pop culture of our days could do. And for sure, from that time onwards, Dante's work has been read, studied, elaborated by writers, critics of the entire world. And some have wanted to distinguish Dante as Dante poet, say, from Dante philosopher and theologian, right? So committing probably one of the most radically shameful acts in the history of mankind, that is basically devaluating of the system of thought that makes up the structure of the poem. So that, it's what people do today. That's the drama of hyper-specialization, why our scientific culture is so disgusting today and better non-existent, and everybody that feels as if there was no purpose, or they don't have any value. They don't see it at historical tradition essentially anymore as a point of reference, because they don't understand anymore. They lack the tools. They lack the comprehensive understanding of it. So you cannot really, let's say, isolate here and there the fragments of Dante's work, so that you can say, this is more authentically poetic or not, right? Or this is just the part I like, the other doesn't really matter, I don't understand it, right? And fortunately enough, at least in the academy, it's been assessed more or less unanimously that especially the comedy must be considered in its globality as a work in which religious faith, feeling, and reason are blended in a indissoluble synthesis, right? That is, banally, if you don't have a religious education, meaning not that you have to have, that you have to be a believer yourself, or to have gone to catechism or these things, but if you have never studied religion, or you think that religion is irrelevant, you don't know what the Bible is or how it's composed, you have never made a research in the Gospels for understanding some important political or historical or even moral, broadly meant, even military, you could argue, meanings. How can you understand, literally anything about the world? Seriously. Right? How can you be... I know these things happen, right? I remember once in our university, there was a Chinese student that went to my tutor because she had to attend her class, medieval history, and I've never known the person, but my tutor told me, this person asked me, what is religion? Right? So when you understand of something like communism, to today's China, and the many other totalitarian regimes that have existed, properly as a anti-human, properly an abomination of the dignity of human worth, right? You have to understand that these things do not have space in the history of civilization, that there is a radical moral superiority in wanting to wipe out ignorance, intended properly as what Satan would have been identified in the same comedy, right? In the truer Christian identity is to say, Dante makes hell because he needs to at purgatory because he created it himself. Nobody the idea was around, but nobody had basically bought into it up until Dante made it. But the idea is, of course, Christianly speaking, that hell is a non-place, right? That this is something that dates back in even pre-Christian things. That is to say, properly, the absence of experience of knowledge is the absence of morality and of worth of human life. So if you don't know these things, you're kind of less of a human being, and this is the point, right? This has nothing to do with the standard potential that human beings have, for which we all have human rights that are ensured. Just, by the way, always remembered by our communities, because there are not human rights floating in the universe for some reason. We are the only ones who can enforce them, right? So it's useless to mention China because of the utterly disgusting essence of itself. Think about the genocides, the deportations that are being carried out right now. But just the plain and radical underschooling, the lack of culture that communism entails by default, the equality in nothingness, in mediocrity, in deficiency, in inferiority. Reading the comedy is a declaration of the superiority of the dignity of human mind and culture and beauty. It's the superiority of men and women as an indissoluble dyad that makes a one that cannot be substituted by anything. The superiority of science against any possible form of atheism, that is a denial of the most elementary scientific principles. The display, of course, of what properly it means to be damned, to be essentially condemned to be always something unchangeable, that you can't improve, right? Something where you will be stuck forever, while Dante gets through the journey because he still can save himself, right? Those people that have had their shot, now they're judged, and there is no way once they're dead, it's over. So it's about the person that you can be to be a better person. And that's what we know. So in terms of clinical psychology, that's fundamentally what all the human capacity lays. The capacity of denying moral relativism, the capacity of acknowledging reality and human limits, being substituted by some arbitrary speculation that doesn't even take into consideration the necessity of knowledge and struggle and sufferance and self-sacrifice and exposure to the world in order to understand the world. Right? We're not habituated anymore to presume that there is a universal order, because it's very simple from an intellective point of view. It's because we don't learn anymore. So we cannot construct an understanding of the world if we lack the knowledge of it. And by knowledge, I mean real knowledge, not, again, spending your life on an iPhone and getting cheap information from whatever media you follow, and not literally closing yourself in a room disconnected from everything and studying for hours and hours and hours for years and years and years. These people were able to do that, plus going at war, plus having to flee their cities, their homes, with basically nothing together with them but knowledge about that same world, right? And the trick is of course, in a sense, also from a conservative perspective, that we have disconnected the theoretical, so not the abstract, but the theoretical element from the practical element, right? And without the two things, right, we don't really go well, right? We do need more theory today than ever, more than practice indeed, for the type of world we need, but we actually should rebalance the thing out. Because it's mostly about the quantity and the quality, consequently, because that's how human brain works, that has not been fueled anymore. Right? So for reading Dante, the point is, of course, you cannot become a medievalist just for reading Dante, but at least you should make the effort to provide yourself with some tools, with some instruments. Banally speaking, I'm not saying in here you should read in the 14th century Italian vernacular, but consider even the importance of translations. Like in history, you cannot really just entrust yourself to translations, right? If you write scientific work and say, I don't understand, like you have to write about, ancient history, ancient Greek. I can't translate it. I use a translator. Yeah, you can do it, but who's reading you saying, why didn't you learn ancient Greek if you're an antiquist? Right? I think you're not a good antiquist. And so, in a sense, this is what Dante teaches us in a way also, that you have to tend towards that extreme. Just as von Clausewitz teaches us, by the way. Because again, if you want to have a general understanding of the world, to start eventually, compacting your knowledge around it, well, you cannot but tend to the infinite. You cannot but try with all your forces to get through this thing, which is the world metaphor of the comedy itself. It's a journey, right? How, can Dante just sit at a table and say, I can save myself because, I feel it? No, he has to go through that damned thing. And you'd say, but Dante actually just wrote something. Well, yeah, but he also went through literal hell in his own life, right? So it's not a coincidence, it's not a speculation, it's not an abstraction, also because the whole work has a structure and a knowledge and an encyclopedical one that without learning and without that experience of the world, without the knowledge of those characters and of international politics and even of law and theology, could not be, right? So that means knowing the world. And that's why this work is so miraculous in nature. I could say much more regarding to this, but consider this, the value of the synthesis. That is not the value of cutting the parts that do not, you think are boring or meaningless, just to highlight the ones that you have to learn by heart without understanding, like, bad students do, right? I was seeing there was an ad here on YouTube that I was seeing that this thing that basically it's an electric device that reads optically the like you pass it on a book page, right? He reads the whole text, it scans it, it reads it, and basically makes a synthesis that he transmits you in your headphones, fundamentally. And so that should be, according to them, the quick, smart way of studying. That is basically you cut all what studying is. That is to say, you have to make your brain work around that text. And knowledge and intelligence and superiority and morality do not stand in skipping the line, but it's making the whole freaking work. And then you complain why people are completely devoid of moral, horizons and lack, and they don't have any purpose, and they fail in life, and there is no meaning anymore. You don't give any meaning, because you basically renounce what your brain has been created for throughout millions of years of evolution, to create the best synthesis that no calculator is ever able to create, because you confuse the material outcome, that is just a phrase, for the process that stands behind the work that has brought to demonstrate that the validity, hopefully, of that phrase, right? So again, skipping the work because you're lazy is not really, a good recipe for the dignity of human civilization. That means, for your personal, fulfillment and the one of the rest of humanity. It's quite the contrary. That's a hellish experience. I mean, I'm sure there is a circle for such people in Dante's Inferno somewhere, or at least can't fit, because of course we know. But in any case, it's a serious problem. So the most authoritative scholars of Dante, and also many school books, right? If you ever I don't know what situation you may have studied that, but often warn about this fragmentary reading of the work, right? This naive identification with the most passionating characters or the most moving scenes. This is actually normal. It's instinctive, right? Just I make an experiment, or two actually. The first one is, if you know anything about Dante's comedy, just list all the episodes or characters or scenes that you remember of. The second experiment is do the same, like make a Google search about Dante's comedy, simply as that, and look at which images pop out. So these two experiments for doing what count in both instances how many of the things that you remember, that the internet remembers, that are connected with hell rather than with the purgatory on the paradise. I tell you because I've been searching the pictures that you see here, and that, as you can see even in my own video, are mostly about the Inferno. That's normal, right? They're mostly about hell. They're mostly about hell, and it's obvious. You know why? It's the same things we said about strategy and the anthropology of warfare. It's about the fact that as human beings, we're most instinctively prone to appreciate the simpler things, the most impressive ones from an emotional point of view, right? The ones that in fact speak more to our animal self. So hell is beautiful. And I admit it myself. I like it more than the others, right? I've read it much more often than heaven and purgatory, and the reason being actually obvious for other reasons. That is to say, first of all, the language in hell is simpler, right? Even if you read in translation, you realize that and as we've seen also in the videos, that the more Dante progresses towards God, and of course the more meanings become kind of complex. And this is the same, the meta, and implicit in a way, and symbolic metaphor, because this is exactly the level of work that you have to achieve as a human being to understand what is beyond, is above, is all around you, right? It's a system that must be understood, and that can't be just figured out from a day to another. It requires a discipline to attain. It requires an understanding of what faith is in properly the realization of your limits, and still the necessity of taking that leap in order to do anything, to achieve anything, to commit any deed for which eventually your life will have been well or badly spent. But overall, right, if you have a serious interest in the work, you can, this is exactly the point. You cannot study just, okay, then hell is simpler, I will just read that. No. if you do that, at least you can, and you will appreciate that, but you will miss 10, 30 times what you could get if you actually got the whole work. And I give you, it's not easy. It's not kind of a book that you can read, well, okay, I read Dante's comedy, just on at the beach in the shade, when I'm relaxed. It won't work, right? It's just like studying the von Kriege or everything that we have seen that requires some application to be understood. So Dante, of course, created this content also to make people bait and hook them, like in the sense, of course, the commoners would have been all about hell, right? And they would have loved it, because the people in general had the lowest instincts, and they're kind of easily, excitable in that sense. But then, the same people, as we've seen, Dante was not a snob in that regard, but were invited to go on and to continue and to be moved by a meaning that would have become ever more difficult to understand, but would have brought them to front of the necessity of the struggle for understanding something so sublime. So, is there a manual to study the comedy? Well, of course, first of all, there are many books. I guess, you have just to search. It's not a big deal. At this point in historiography, that provide you properly with this kind of criticism, right? And that should be accompanied to a rigorous preliminary study of the work, and also at least sensitize to a philologically and historiographically meditated reading. It's obvious, as we were saying before, that reading Dante's work in the original language, especially the comedy, would require at that point you should know Latin, you should know the Florentine vernacular of the time, which at some point is a bit prohibitive because not even modern Italians are able to read correctly the comedy without a philological or story. There are mostly, in fact, some paraphrases of that because it's really complex, right? It's not easy. It's because the matter is complex, right? It's not just about some archaism in the language. Dante spoke a language that a modern Italian would have understood without any problem, but it's what is written there that is ultra complex from a literary, historical, philological, theological point of view. That is, you can even have a translation of that and an explanation, but the references sometimes are unintelligible because you can't have that in the... Yes, you can have some notes explaining that, but you need fundamentally notes that explain the meaning plus kind of a translation of it, because there's two things on a different level. So it's not even an excruciatingly difficult task, right? Especially with a translation, but still it requires some hand in the process, which seemingly it's a lot to ask nowadays. In any case, it's a common experience. Like we've all been there already. Like probably nor the artisans of the shopkeepers that in the 14th century recited Dante by heart had ever read the whole poem, nor they understood, in depth every implicit information or deciphered perfectly every philosophical concept, right? It's obvious. But this is, in a way, great part of Dante's genius, right? It's the capacity to attract in spite of that. It's the capacity of making the information, really the greatness of the work shining through, right? Attracting to you. And it's a metaphor of the same divine perfection. It's the idea that we live in a world that has been entrusted to us after creation for us to decipher and to preserve and to understand. And we live in a world that is apparently obscure and dominated by evil forces and by the unknown, right? We don't see, we are limited, etc. But we know, we feel, we perceive, we tend towards the idea of a perfection. And the more we understand the world, and the more we are brought to approach that. It's a scientific and neurocognitive realization. It's properly the idea that the more you get through reality, and the more you have a grasp of what the truth could be, that you would never understand because you can't understand it by definition. Doesn't matter how much you study, much you discover, whatever. Nobody will ever know the truth, right? But still, the truth is reflected in our world, in our reality. Hence, there cannot be two equals. There cannot be somebody says, this thing went in that way, and the other says, no, it went in that way, and they're both right. Right? It cannot be. And this is the discriminant of individual responsibility and the rejection of moral relativism. Because you cannot deny that something went in a way if the thing went in another one. And there are two opinions of that, because it's always about this. It's always about what you think of that. And we have the means to find out, in a sense, but we'll never fully find out. So what this means is that you cannot abstract relativistically and say, so it doesn't mean anything, and everything changes, and there is no standpoint. But on the contrary, you should be brought by the accumulation of knowledge to realize that things are the way they are. Hell, when you are expert on something, how degrading such misinterpretations are for the person who's stating them. But yourself as an expert feels more than else how challenging that expertise comes, and with how many doubts and difficulties and further thoughts And that's what we're brought to do, ideally, right? To sort out, to find out. We'll never fully understand, but still we will have done something that will have made the difference. And that's the whole meaning of human civilization and existence. Because we know that we do it for a reason that is not abstract, that we haven't arbitrarily decided on the base of nothing. Because otherwise nothing would have any sense. There would not even life would be possible physically in a world like that. So it's obvious that there is a path, and that this path is taken, if anything, because you have an impulse that you cannot quite understand, and that you're not meant to understand, but that it is designed for you to get through this world and to learn and sort out things and fix them and improve the situation. This is the comedy in its greatness. And in fact, what I said before about, you should have a level of expertise to understand this world. Of course, if you want to understand it fully, or nobody will understand it fully ever, because works are not meant to be understood fully, because we can't. Again, neurocognitively, it's impossible. It doesn't mean anything scientifically. But let's say the best advice is to just start reading. Just doing the damn thing, right? Without worrying too much if you don't understand everything at the first read. It's important to get sucked in by, serenely enjoying the suspense and, the plot twists, the extraordinary gallery of human types that are moved by strange and terrible passions, the monsters and the demons of hell. And gradually, through ever more consistent, tasting of the other two canticles, you will discover how much intellectual depth and anxiety of knowledge, thirst of knowledge, stylistic wisdom Dante had to condensate in his own poem. Remember this, that there's never been in the history of mankind, nor in the Enlightenment, nor in the ancient world, any man so truly, sincerely, and honestly thirsty of knowledge like the medieval one. And you know why? Because they didn't give anything for granted, unlike we do. Because they had to make the damn thing. Right? In a world where, think about Dante and the idea of the empire, why that is perceived to be important, why still has to be an autonomy within it, and how refined the concept is, how much it speaks at the root of what eventually made the West, in a sense. So this constant negotiation, not an absolutistic, stagnant, granitic power that is impossible to change, or at least it prevents it, at the end of the day collapses within itself. But nor even an anarchy, where everybody has the presumption that whatever they think has any meaning whatsoever just because it's their opinion, which seems to be what most people still somewhat believe. Again, there is a need of authority, of order, discipline, but this has to be mediated by the greater powers, by the individuals, and there can't be justice without. And it is perhaps by recognizing in this figure of solitary researcher of the truth, or at least approacher of the truth, and of justice, in Dante, an interlocutor that can tell us today something on the meaning of our life. And I could go on because, I did read at least the whole comedy, and it's something recurring in a way. I had even, used it philologically sometimes for, because I studied war, as I studied mostly the Holy Roman Empire in general, and exactly in the early 14th century. So you cannot go anywhere without this without Dante in general. And starting from the comedy is important, however, if you are interested in this broader journey that you can take with the author, because the first impact is, right, it's magic in a sense, because it's exactly what we were saying before relatively to the capacity of Dante to, to pose you in a situation where you can't really relate to what he means, right? The beginning is famously enough about the fact that he felt he had gone astray, right? And he, the beauty of it is that he doesn't make you actually participate to the reasons why this happened, right? It's a general statement. It's an existential one. It says, at this point, in the midst of my life, and this is, at the time that there is all the symbolism. He was from 1265, so 1300 was a bit, this secularist, symbology, the year of the Jubilee, all these things. But in any case, at that point, 35 was the midst of somebody's life, was conceived like that. And you can argue in a way that it is so still today, right? At the time, at least, childhood mortality was quite high. Like just 1/3 of the kids made it from birth to adulthood, and then you could expect to live around 70 on average, right? And today it's mostly 80, right? And it's not, if you think about that, it's not even this much more, right? At least child mortality is fortunately the thing we have improved dramatically on, and so that's, but our existence is still somewhat around the same view, and the idea of having gone astray at this point, right, in the midst of somebody's lives, when you should have fixed most things. And this is, think about that. Think about all the exiles like him, and that had lived such experience, right, and that had felt like something has gone terribly wrong. And this has not gone wrong just because of us, right? It's gone wrong because of the whole world. It's gone wrong because the emperor failed, the pope didn't make his own duty, and much more than that. And so Dante eventually illustrates this in all the historical figures, in fact in the work, recent figures, right? Also quite famous ones internationally, but also the ones that he had met and that his readers would have known. In a way, there are so many of these subtle references, even to actually even obscure characters that we don't know too much about. Sometimes Dante is probably a historical source, as I was saying before. And also these archetypal figures, mostly from mythology, that are meant especially to fulfill that kind of role, because of course then there are all the biblical figures, and that's another thing. There are also archetypal in nature, especially from the Old Testament, but in practice, let's say there is this intro in hell that Dante is led through in almost fearing, right? There is this moment in the meeting with the wild beasts that essentially prevent him the crossing into going back, right? And that's yet another great metaphor, because there's no way back, right? You would expect there was, or that life. Here's back to the life that we knew, the life that we were promised, in a sense, the one in which we failed, right? Remember that in this sense had also lost meaningful people, not just his house and his his freedom, at least legally, in his homeland. And there was a lot there going on. You can imagine about the various losses. Think about his friend that in Cavalcanti that he indirectly sentenced to death because he exiled him, and he died of malaria later on. And so the great vices that render it impossible to go back and to fix, by the way. And so there is only one way, the most difficult one, the one through what men have never seen before. So it's an ultra-terrene experience, Dante is elected to that, but let's say the metaphor is for everybody, right? You have to, in a way, fight with your own dragon, right? You have to see evil. You have to go back in the darkest abyss of your soul, and to come back with the realization that you have to fix yourself. There is some psychological insight to that, and this is powerful as much as you realize the grievance, the pain that you can experience in life, and that make you realize that you're not too I can't make it. Right, Dante is talking to you in that moment because he couldn't make it himself, and he needed to go through that experience. And this goes on, as you know. The story is it's but just the beginning. It's important in that he is offered, by the way, as a God here. It's God that was, so he's the supreme reason. But he's also helped by a pagan, by Virgil, that naturally now acknowledges after his death and the come of Christ, that he couldn't recognize previously in his life, that is the new order, that's the actual truth, right? And so he's sent, however, as the symbol of poetry, embodied the greatest poet in Latin literature, that is a huge opportunity. It means that, of course, there is a virtue in intellect, there is a virtue in knowledge, as we were saying before. And so this knowledge, this reason, the soul that will never see paradise, because he was condemned not to, at that point, to remain suspensed, right, in the Olympus, where that was the destiny. He was not punished because they didn't know Christ yet. They had seen those, that Virgil in the Aeneas is, fundamentally also Christian literature interpreted as, he was talking about the child that would regenerate the world, and that was adopted. There were visions that the world, the Romans, this universal idea was conceived, were perceived, and so that the journey begins, and also the journey with Virgil leaves Dante at the end of the purgatory because he cannot go to heaven, while Beatrice can. So Beatrice has been, Dante's beloved, that had prematurely died, and that had interceded to God, medium Mary, to allow Dante to save himself and to be of use to redeem humanity in God's project. So Dante, obviously, as you understand it, thought highly of himself, this mission. But it's relevant that also this is not a megalomaniacal thing. It's properly realizing the power of man, right, over nature, over the world, and over his own his own actions, right, which he's judged, but he's allowed in his freedom to act, which is a relevant idea. That doesn't matter whether God has already knows, right? He has left you properly the chance of making the difference for yourself. Even though he already knows, it's still on you. So this laws of meaning, in an incredible way, every single action that you make, because it's part of a greater whole that you wouldn't fundamentally understand otherwise. And think even in here, aside from the different culture and whatever medievals felt like in different ways, and probably more intensely than us, what it can mean, in this comprehensive understanding of reality, the death of the person you love the most, and that you also have this, it's not just like your parents or somebody who is meant to precede you and to leave you first if nature goes its way normally, but somebody you get inspired to at the point you want to be a better person because of the love, and properly the falling in love, the clinically pathological state that is such a double-edged sword that can make you really the best person you can be, but at the same time can destroy you entirely. And thinking that this woman, and considered, by the way, at the time, we don't know how Beatrice died, but probably of childbirth. She had been married by another nobleman, and the whole affair was platonic with Dante and so on. So, but even properly the destiny here, the role of women in the poem is very important overall, and even in here, every kind of aspect of the most intense passion to be, greatest holiness and so on, is reflected upon. Remember, okay, we've seen in the other videos how important Beatrice had been properly to inspire Dante, also to her death especially. He was depressed after she died, and he got out of it through philosophy, through theology, through studying, through learning, right? And so that's where Dante matured the idea of becoming a prophet in a political and moral sense, and reflect on it. Because even in here, I think it's legitimate to say that, of course, we all understand what love can do in terms of motivation, and these extremes that warring ones that humanly speaking, that can make you achieve, but also what meaning you have to give at something, an experience like this in your life. What are you going to do of it? I think it's a very beautiful thing to be inspired by love when you want to still stress the necessity of an authority, of an order, right? So that people can live in a way that, can facilitate the hardships of life, including these ones. And so the world is imperfect, is unjust, it's rigged by sin, but at the same time, the only ones that can make a difference are humans. And so there can't be but a superposition between love and authority in this sense. It's the same meaning of God, of course, and that's why it's so necessary as an idea in the first place. So these are real things that Dante lived. So that's why you have to appreciate this work, because I think the first attitude instinctively said, I open this book, is boring. Right, this guy, weird guy from the 14th century, what the hell is trying to say? I don't understand anything, all these references to the Bible, to mythology, what he's doing this for? Why he's mixing all this stuff, right? And ultimately, the capacity of this journey throughout reality, throughout existence, throughout politics, throughout war, throughout suffering, and sometimes, properly certain ideas that we're not meant even to reach, to fully grasp, right? To fully understand and fully accept in a sense. Growing challenged by this task of understanding the world better. I say so because certain punishments, for example, in hell, are meant by Dante not to appear. I say they're all meant to appear just, of course, because there is no other way around that, but to make us realize how much few can make the difference, for better or for good, by the way, because this is also about the reward and salvation, right? There are certain episodes where, and this is the morality of Christianity, that, it's not much about what you actually do that makes you, a better or worse person, right? Paradoxically, it's the worse that destroys you at the point that you want to rebuild yourself as a better person, but it's rather about your attitude towards that, because you may actually be a great sinner and to do horrible things, but eventually to grow aware of that and kind of repenting truly for that. And truly you need to suffer, because again, the purgatory is there. It's a world of pain, but of hope at least at the same time. In hell there is no There's no hope. There's just pain. And the question here is not just, in fact, how much you evaluate this judgment on the basis of how much these people have been given, but what they have done in life to deserve that, for better or for worse. And that's the point of the whole thing. You can be instead a good person, apparently, or at least not doing not a criminal, not doing, but being still raked by by something terrible, not being a honest person, being selfish, being dishonest, truly, I mean, and making other people suffer, maybe without formally breaking any law, right? But still doing something that you chose, for the worst of reasons, and these things do happen, and this naturally Dante illustrates better still in for those systems that are more complex to manage, like politics, so where by a certain degree you have to roll the dice and risk, right? But others are still some very intimate, inner reasons, right? That are ruining even certain figures that are quite positive and are seen in the same held by Dante as quite positive people. So in fact that he moves himself as saying that the penalty there, but he also understands that, because he's meant not to understand it initially. But that's the measure of our sinful nature. That we mostly don't know the evil that we do, but or at least even when we do, it's always in between, right? And that's where there is no excuse, because it's never about ignorance per se only. It's about how you prevent yourself to do more and to pretend to do more, and say, I'm just the way I am, I don't care about being a better person. At that point, there is something seriously wrong with you. And at that point, it's likely that you would have, sentenced heavily for that, because that's the idea of justice, and it's not much of the comfort of the idea of justice. It's weird when people say, because in this sense you think that, religions are being created just for giving a fake sense of comfort. What comfort is there actually in the idea of hell? And don't you think that there is a reason why that was invented, and maybe for blaming the opponents or something like that, or not? Well, if anything, there is a debate, because as long as there is a heaven and a hell, there is always somebody that is saying, it's not just one way direction. We have to determine whether, and so politically, socially, this negotiation is always there, and so it's always a struggle between good and evil that can never be resolved humanly speaking. And Dante, after all, provides us with a dramatic picture, but is in the sense kind of a neutral one. I mean, of course, there is the triumph of good, but at the same time, we are presented with the realization of pain, the realization of an existence that is always challenged, is always difficult to handle in a way or another. And the rest is just to discover, I would say, how Dante makes it, and what proofs he has to undergo, and how this system provides with the measure of the effort, right? So that it's not it's earned properly in salvation, and that that is the entire meaning of how this revolves around. And there is a humility and a let's say still, however, a confidence, like in the fact that after all there is a greater good that allows to make it in, let's say, in life, as much as the ultimate end is concerned. Of course, the ultimate judgment is concerned, but still, even in the most horrifying of situations, so there is always a hope, and a meaning that do not come less, whatever it happens. And I think that it's important to see the world in these terms, because your action is constantly tied to it. It's not simply, say this thing is falls out of your moral barycenter. No, it's actually a cold realization about the earthly condition that you are the only one who can change in a sensible fashion. Because again, it's always up to you, not somebody else. In any case, this is just eventually the interpretation you can give, but let's say concentrating on the work is better per se. It's not really a matter of how eventually you're going to receive this, but first knowing how it is, and this has, in my opinion, a great relevance. In any case, without digressing further, I confess that I'm doing something else while I'm recording this. I'm make short recordings and then answer messages and so on. So I don't know how this is going to turn, but I think that the introduction and the relevance of this work shall make this is the last video of it. We will talk about Dante anyway at some point. It's just that this was the chance for doing it kind of more comprehensively and more interestingly, let's say, for itself, right? For the work, for the man, for the meaning that this has in the history of civilization, and why it is relevant today. And it's never supposed not to be relevant, right? It's just the subjectivistic attitude of different times and people that have wanted, let's say, to transform it into something else, or to interpret it, or to compare it. You cannot. It doesn't make any sense until you don't acquire a sound understanding of the work itself, of the context, for which you cannot make comparisons. You can't just look at it and say, okay, if by a scale, this is definitely the single most important thing written in the Middle Ages, as it was recognized basically always, because I can't think of any other work that has ever even remotely come close, if anything, properly to the consensus and to the obvious evidence, self-evidence, the fact that this was beyond, and any other great author in Western civilization fundamentally took inspiration from Dante and so on, and so even people will make comparison, and if you listen to the very beginning of this series, what I'm referring to, right, to people that apparently can't distinguish the fact that there's a difference between the Middle Ages and modern India, right, and so that making comparison, it's not really wise in the first place. But however, this is it. We can conclude it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video, this series. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.